Hi, this is Paul. A couple of days ago, this popped up into my YouTube feed, and I thought, oh, now this is going to be interesting. So, Alex O'Connor is probably the most thoughtful of the apes that I featured in my video the other day. Now, when I say ape, I'm not meaning it. That's the word they choose to call us. So, I'm not meaning it as sort of a cheap put down. Although, so if he wants to be an ape, he can be an ape. And he's I think probably the most thoughtful of the three that I had in the video. And even though I think he's still got some legacy code of the 13-year-old atheist, he is, I think, working things out. And this video for me was a very interesting example of working things out, because I thought, as I would expect from John, a very thoughtful, good faith conversation. The more I think about these, not necessarily the four horsemen, but these YouTube celebrity atheists, the more I realize just how much like Protestant preachers they are. And this video seemed to make the case, except they're sort of arguing from the other end. And so when it came to this question about time and meaning, which is something that I've disagreed with John on for a while, and I've heard his arguments, I thought it was very interesting listening to Alex engage those arguments from the other side. So let's have a listen.
I want to maybe
Once I get my settings straight.
slightly change gears. We've mentioned religion a few times, and I think it's something that's of particular interest to my listeners.
Of course.
How much of the present?
Again, to his listeners from the other way. Or I know, some in the corner listen to Alex and say quite nice things about Alex in the comment section to me.
Problem that we find ourselves confronted with, do you think is specifically due to a decline in religious belief, rather than, let's say, religious practice?
Well, I don't want to do the typical philosopher's thing of asking you what you
Now,
mean.
before John answers that question, O'Connor's been listening carefully, and you've got 1P versus 3Ps. And of course, a big piece of, Peterson has called it the counter-enlightenment. I don't know if that name will stick. I don't know if that's the best name for it. But a big piece of that has been John making the case that the other 3Ps, I'll say it this way, the propositional truth is always nested within the other 3Ps in many respects. And a new atheist, by virtue of their location, this includes James Lindsay, sort of stays with the one, because the Enlightenment was all about the supremacy of the one over the other three. And so that Alex sort of hones in on this question. And this question, I think, then creates the meat of the contribution of this video, because the first while of the video is getting to know each other, getting clear on things, really just sort of building trust in each other. People don't appreciate the fact that the other 3Ps in a conversation mean we're building trust with each other. We're listening to each other. We're sort of building rapport with each other, and we're sort of getting to the moment that we can actually get to a place that we differ with. And while we disagree with this and try to work our way through it, it'll be okay. Nobody's going to stand up and walk off. You can find that on his channel. Stand off and, Peter Hitchens standing up and walking off, or cussing out, or losing their mind, or kneecapping, or any of these things. So,
But one of the famous tropes, of course, in the social sciences is that religion doesn't have a stable referent. If you mean not only what we might call institutional religion, but also civic religion. Like I said, I think Americanism.
Now, this is a tremendously important broadening that John is doing here. One of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been trying to figure out how to talk about Islam is exactly this point that John makes, that religions are all over the place. and there's just a few identifying characters that we watch, and then we tend to approach them in the way that they've been approached for the last 100 years, 200 years, from a sort of a studies of world religion class. Again, you can pick up Houston Smith's The World's Religions, and that's sort of an academic way to go about them. But I am increasingly dissatisfied with that approach. Now, again, I'm a Christian Reformed minister, part of a confessional church, and so with another hat on, I've been having conversations about confessionality. That doesn't mean that I don't believe confessionality is unimportant, but I think sometimes it's overestimated in terms of it's one very useful way to have insight into something that is combinatorially too massive to see. And so it's good that John sort of, his first step here is to broaden this and say, now, there have been lots of religious hyperobjects, spirits. Again, language is difficult. There have been lots of things going on here. And so let's not just play with Christianity, yes or no. Let's make sure we broaden it sufficiently.
Really held that institutional religion, but where, like, also civic religion. Like I said, I think Americanism really held that space, especially within the narrative context of the Cold War for Americans, quite a bit. But
well, I think people might want to say that there's. I've spoken to a few people on this podcast who have suggested or endorsed the idea that because of the decline in traditional religious belief, because human beings are religious creatures, they can't help but sort of continually demonstrate the aptness in the observation that it's not whether you worship, but what you worship. Right? That's a sort of a common piece of wisdom.
Now, I don't know the degree to which Alex has embraced what he just said. Again, this has been I was taught this in middle school, in my Christian school. All of life is religious. Now, John's going to sort of pivot on the worship thing, and he's got a good, strong point on this, because most of us have experience in the West. But if you sort of broaden it in a Petersonian and Pageauian mode of attention, again, part of what is so difficult to talk about this is that it is in fact so vast that you have to somehow find a way to get a handle on it. And again, propositional differences have been a way.
Okay. Whether you agree with it or not. And I wonder if somebody could say, well, yeah, I mean, we have that kind of pseudo-religious political thinking today. I mean, you already referenced it yourself, that people are thinking in religious terms in many ways about their modern politics. That is to say that if there is something unique about now, it can't be the decline of religious thinking or religious ways of behaving, of getting together and sharing some kind of common goal or common understanding. It must have something to do with the belief content, with the fact that these kinds of pseudo-religious political movements, the reason we call them pseudo-religious is because they lack important content, such as perhaps the existence of a deity or something like that.
Okay, so I want to give that's a good counterpoint. I want to respond to it, and and it goes to why I was expressing qualms. I think there's there are religions, and then there are things that hang on the border between religion and not religion, like Stoicism and Neoplatonism, in which worship is perhaps not the best way of understanding what those things are organized around.
Okay, now we're having a little difficulty with the terminology religion. We can sort of back it off and say worldviews. And of course, John has been making the point, I think quite rightly, that many of these ancient philosophies are closer to religions today than where we tend to silo them in terms of, oh, that's philosophy, that's not religion. It's like going into a yoga studio and saying, no, we don't practice religion here. Oh, in the 1970s, I'd walk into an evangelical church and they'd say, Christianity isn't a religion, it's a relationship. That little meme is one I could make a whole video on.
I do Tai Chi Chuan and Qigong. Taoism doesn't seem to have at least many branches of it, and the ones that go back to Shuangzi and Lao Tse they don't talk about worship at all. And so I'm a little bit hesitant about making that the central thing.
And I think John's right, but they do manage attention, and a big part of worship is management of attention. And so all of this meditation work, this is all managing attention.
And towards that, I think the content that's lacking in the pseudo-religious ideologies isn't propositional content by and large. I think, Marxism and Nazism both gave people fantastic, and I don't mean in the moral sense, I mean in the effective sense of narrative. Right?
Thank you for clarifying for the sake of monetization of this podcast.
Yeah, very much. But I think it goes to what we were talking about. I think that a lot of these pseudo-religious ideologies are very thin soup when it comes to practices, both individual and collective, for the cultivation of wisdom.
And I think that's another great point. And so again, as I'm thinking about Islam, and you're thinking about practices, and you're thinking about, let's say, I pulled up a Twitter thread of a woman whose parents were immigrants from an Islamic country here, and she basically talked about how good their life was since they came to America. They were able to get jobs in the American university system and in the American business world, and they were treated with respect, and they were not it was their ethnicity, their skin color, their religion, these were things that were not held against them. But now, and this is part of the tricky thing when it comes to practices, they came over as people with university degrees from where they came from. And those universities, of course, themselves sort of came along with colonial things. And so all of these practices of secularity that we have, in fact, sort of segmented as not religious at all. This is just being a good person. This isn't being religious, as if there's no some of the other aspects of religion, which is focus of attention. Well, how do you treat women? Well, how do you treat the weak? Well, how do you treat those who are above you? Now, again, this isn't solely to Christianity in terms of how these things, but these are all aspects of practices that are the result of deep cultural formation. And even though they've been far broader than the specific things of what we call religion in the West, they have in fact been all over the place.
Yes. Okay. So after I believe in the coming of the revolution, and I've read Marx and I can memorize it, and I do my protesting, but what do I do to cultivate skills and virtue, access alternative states of mind and consciousness, contemplate and aspire to having a different kind of identity?
And of course, all of those things are within value hierarchies. And I would say all of those things tend to point towards a telos. I'm not necessarily even saying a telos beyond the empirical world we live in, a telos within sociology. This is the kind of person I try to aspire to be. This person is a model to me. I have seen something in this person which I aspire to become and to emulate. So there's all sorts of very religious things happening in all of these worldviews.
And so I think actually the thin soup in the pseudo-religious things is not so much a lack of propositional content. And I'll give you just one piece of preliminary empirical evidence to back that up. But I think it's the practice. So my one of my RIAs, I'm a supervisor in his PhD. He did some work, some empirical work, and there are various measures. And
now I'm going to assume that RA is a research assistant and not a resident advisor. Not all of us are here in this university system, but I assume a research assistant.
problematic, so you have to use multiple measures, but there's now existing measures, validated measures for sort of assessing how wise people are. And then you can sort of do triangulate with how the people that a community deems wise, and you can get sort of a fairly good plausible sorting. And then what you can ask is, well, what difference does belonging to a religious community make to that? And you can compare that to people who don't belong to one. Now you get two findings. The first finding will make religious people happy. The second people will piss them off. The first finding is the people in the religious framework do better than the secular. The second finding is there's no significant difference between these frameworks. And so the propositional...
Now, I'm actually not pissed off by the second one. I'm not surprised by it at all, actually, frankly. And this goes into the care with which I am approaching the Islamic conversation for exactly the reasons of that woman's Twitter thread about her parents, who are extremely well-behaved, socialized participants in the American educational and economic systems. And this also gets to part of my argument that even though secularity, and I'll have to talk at some point about this war against secularity that emerged in the evangelical world, which is, in a sense, some of the Christian nationalists, some of the dread Christian nationalists are in some ways just carrying on that war, because what they really want plastered all over the place is Jesus. This fight has been within my little subtradition for a long time. Within the culture, and this is sort of the tension between the mainline aspect of the Christian Reformed Church and the evangelical aspect of the Christian Reformed Church. I know of a case where there was a division amongst a group of people that had been working long and hard towards creating, I'm going to try and keep this really broad so I don't trigger anybody who might know of this situation. Basically, one side said, we want to bring in these children and instruct them in the way they should go, and we're going to have Bible class, and we're going to have all of these things, and we're very much a Christian institution, but it isn't going to be all about Jesus, 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 Bible verse, Bible verse, Bible verse, Bible verse. And that tension between those two ways is some of that tension with respect of what John is talking about. I believe within secularity that Jesus did a tremendous amount of smuggling. And just like the yoga studio or the evangelical church that said Christianity isn't a religion, it's a relationship. Colonialism, dum dum dum, was smuggling the values of Jesus all around the world and permeated institutions with them, universities, business. I mean, even I remember going to the Dominican Republic, and one of the issues that we'd always have was, let's say we want to have a community development program. Maybe we're going to use some mission money and help a group of people establish a little colmado, which is a little store. And the purpose of the store is some income generation for the family and some jobs for some of the people in this Haitian community in the Dominican Republic. And they're stressed out with this. And immediately the pastors are like, well, the pastor's wife should run the store. And right away, there was tension between sort of the missionaries who are like, we call this a conflict of interest. And they'd be like, I don't know what that means. And they really didn't know what that meant because, of course, if it's coming from the mission, the pastors and the pastors' wives and all of them should eat first. And this gets into a whole slew of cultural things. But now we wouldn't say conflict of interest. That's not a Christian value. That's just a matter of corruption. Oh, corruption's a word that was first a theological word before it was a business or an HR word or a political word, you know. Because what we believed was all of these values embedded in the way to go about even just starting a little business as an income generation project for very poor people. So whenever John makes this point, I often think of the fact that most of the religions, then most of the people, and most of the practices that people are thinking about have been those that here in the West, we have already sort of secularized. We've now, by virtue of where we lay our lines, called these no longer religious. Well, that's just corruption. That's just conflict of interest. That's just good, bad, right, and wrong. And my guess is that these surveys that show exactly what John shows are pretty much probably, along with, psychology and sociology, have had this difficulty in their science for a while, that they said, well, this is universal. Well, where's your sample size? I just finished getting through all 8 episodes of The Conquest of the Aztecs, and the rest is history. Well, did you include the Mesoamericans? Well, no, of course, they're all dead. Well, they can't fill out the survey then, can they? Because there's so much built into our world, and there's so much practice that has gone on without, and in a sense what secularization did was just pluck all the religious tags off things and say, there's no religion here. There's no religion here. That's just, we're avoiding conflict of interest. Oh, there's nothing religious about that. What about that word corruption? Is there anything religious about that? No, there's nothing religious about that. Oh. And so deep into the systems, becoming religious, and I would dare bet synagogues, mosques, Buddhist facilities in America, by virtue of the way status works in our collective culture, meant that certain kinds of behavior gained you status, such as being kind to others, showing generosity to the weak. All of these things gave you status in a context which was deeply impacted by Christianity over a very long time. And I'm not saying that those values, because they clearly were within some of these other religious traditions, well, they got accentuated because of Christianity, even within the labels of the other religions. So in other words, if you're going to start a mosque in the United States that promotes certain kinds of practices that have resulted in the loss of a lot of lives, like buildings coming down and explosions and things like that, if those are your religious practices in your mosque in the United States, that is not going to go anywhere. And I don't even mean that because law enforcement's going to come in. I'm saying that because Americans are going to hear this and say, that's just wrong. Because there's so much Christianity that's gotten in from below. And so, I remember when I was going to make a video when John was on Lex Fridman about this point, because there's been a tremendous amount of Christianization, or at least certain values within other religions that have been accentuated. And, in some ways, religious texts are sort of like the genetics, and the prevailing culture is sort of like the epigenetics. And so what happens is that even people living in the United States, by virtue of the culture here, reread cultures, values they find in the United States long since brought in by the people who sort of brought the culture and formed the culture of the United States, now read back into their religion and say, oh, it's these portions of my religious text that I think are really good. Because the truth is that all of these religious texts are too large for everyone to sort of read the whole thing. So there is, in fact, a relevance realization that happens within the combinatorial explosiveness, and the epigenetics from the context impacts how they read their text. And that's one of the ways that Jesus has been sort of recoding a lot of the other religious traditions and practices.
That is between different religious frameworks.
Yes, exactly. So that, and I think there's other converging evidence, but that's, sort of clear that what's doing the heavy lifting in the wisdom cultivation is not the propositional content.
The fact that you...
And again, I think John's right on that. I agree. What's doing the heavy lifting is not the propositional content, because the cultural, contextual, those other 3 Ps within the culture and the context are selecting within the propositional context what to highlight and what to accentuate.
That religion does it best, but it's not clear, or you say it's clear that there's not a difference between the different kinds of religious beliefs and religious practices as to which one does it best.
Yeah.
I wanted to push back on this idea that it's not got anything to do with the propositional belief, and that is the content of the belief, but rather something like the existence of the belief. Or I'm not quite sure how you'd phrase it. But
see, and now I don't think it's just a matter of phraseology. I think a big part of this has been the blindness that New Atheism has had towards religion. They have, again, just primarily focused on the propositional content because, in terms of practice, many American evangelicals and many American atheists live very similar lives. And they just sort of account for their behavior based on, I mean, it's fairly post hoc. Well, I behave this way because I'm a Christian. Well, y'all behave this way because you're part of a common culture and you have a high degree of commonality in your value system.
I think there is something that's offered by most religious thought in one way or another.
Sure.
That isn't offered by secular thinking, by a scientific worldview, I should say an exclusively materialistic worldview, or indeed the sort of pseudo-religious political movements. And that's the existence of an afterlife. Of course, not all religious beliefs have a concept of an afterlife in the...
Okay, and this is where I want to go. But before I get there, I want to play something else. Okay, so we've had this James Lindsay drive-by against Ortho Bros and a bunch of dread Christian nationalists and all of these people. And so, you know, Jonathan Macho's like, well, let's talk about it. And James Lindsay's like, no. Okay. But he's going to talk to his friend Benjamin. And Benjamin is going to sort of start poking at some of these points with James. This part of the conversation I thought was super important, again, because of my own relevance realization, because I'm trying to figure out how to approach this whole issue of Islam, especially within this context, because of course, Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Sarah Hyder.
For years, because people always bring up the so-called substitution hypothesis that we're substituting one religion for another religion.
And of course, that's Peter Boghossian, who's his partner in crime in the whole academics papers hoax that they pulled off.
Mm-hmm. And the lack, the decline in religiosity, people are searching for meaning, and this is where they find meaning. And no doubt there's some degree of that, but the psychosocial reasons behind religious adherence are pretty well established in the academic literature on psychology of religion. And
okay, slow that down. The psychosocial...
One of adherence, no doubt there's some degree of that, but the psychosocial reasons behind religious adherence are pretty well.
Reasons behind religious adherence. These are motivations. These are sort of broad categories of why people look to. Now, again, it's in the social sciences, so it's nested very much in the secular definition of religion, this sort of plucking the tags off so that things can pass through customs. It's like you had a religious customs officer say, are you smuggling religion into my country? No religion here. This is just about corruption and conflict of interest and treatment of women and all. That has nothing to do with religion. This has to do with human rights. And I could cue Tom Holland's, well, if you're into human rights, you might as well believe in the resurrection. None of these things are self-evident. But anyway, pluck the religious tag off, and this is human rights. No religion here. So what are these motivations?
Well established in the academic literature on psychology of religion, and one of them is in fact a meaning-making structure.
Okay, so meaning-making structure. So that's religions help make meaning. Well, how? And again, go back to Theo Vaughn's John Vervaeke's conversation with Theo Vaughn, and he mentions Peter Berger in his conversation with Alex too. You sort of have, it's basically your worldview and how your little story fits in with the big story, and basically it's the agent-arena relationship, and the big story is sort of the arena and you're the agent, and by virtue of all the aspects of that, you're trying to make your way up.
Another one is to define social groups.
Okay, religions define social groups, and this is part of the reason we use propositions, because they're labels that we can follow. So it's a Catholic church. Okay, Catholic. Well, there's all their propositional beliefs. So the Protestants, there's their propositional beliefs. Now, again, it's mostly academics and people who have been to university that sort of know these things, because generally speaking, if I get a phone call from someone that say, what kind of church are you? And if you've answered this question, tried to answer this question dozens and dozens of times, you would have a better understanding of what people out there know. So then I just try words on. We're a church. Oh, yeah. But if you drive down to Stockton, you'll find a Buddhist church. And I remember when I first drove by that building, I thought, Well, there's a funny use of that word church. Is that a Muslim church? They wouldn't call it that. Is that a Jewish church? They wouldn't call it that. But these immigrants from Japan probably, well, this is a Buddhist church. Oh, okay. So we're a church. Okay, so that's like Christian. That's a word that most people know. Like Jesus and stuff. Yeah, there you go. Okay, Jesus. Well, what kind of Jesus and stuff? And the difficulty is that usually the person has in their mind a matrix that they're trying to fit you into. And my job is to try to figure out what on earth is their matrix so I can communicate with them. So most of those matrix, and this is again to John Vervaeke's point, most of these elements of the matrix have to do with practice. Well, do you baptize babies? There's a big one. Yes, we do baptize babies. Oh. Are you a denominational church? I remember one woman, her granddaughter was coming to the church, and so I talked to her after the services. I'm so glad she found a non-denominational church. It's like, actually, we are a denominational church. And then when I used Harry Potter without disparaging him in a sermon reference, then she really had a fit. Politics. If I say Protestant, I don't know what that means. Okay. Reformed. Part of the reason that we changed the name from Sacramento Christian Reformed Church, which it was when I came to the church, was that name didn't help anybody unless they were from the Christian Reformed Church. And they already had a yearbook that listed them all. And so that was a pointless name. So we changed it to Living Stones, where people are just like, they don't expect to know what that means. So this is the difficulty. So again, so the first one is sort of meaning, and the second one is naming. Who's been calling? Oh, I know who's been calling me from that number. You know, it's one thing to deal with people suffering from schizophrenia in a face-to-face relationship. It's much more difficult over the telephone. Anyway, back to the video.
And the third one is a control axis. It is to obtain a sense of, whether it's genuine or not, a sense of control over the environment you find yourself in and yourself.
Okay, and this is a key one. And this one is, and I liked why he laid these three things out, because they are very, very common. We use them to sort of define in-groups and out-groups. And this third one, you know, meanings, we use them for meaning. And then, now these three aren't exhaustive, obviously. And then the third one is a sense of life is scary. How can I buffer the scariness of life? And again, across the board, religions tend to operate on this, for this. My gods will keep me safe. I have this altar in my house. I've done the proper sacrifices to the gods, so our voyage is going to go through. I've sacrificed my daughter for fair winds so we can go and attack Troy. These are the kinds of things. And so these three things are out there. Now, James is going to talk about kind of the woke, and I think actually he sort of missed it in this clip, because I think for the most part, many, and all of these tend to be in the context of a social hierarchy, a social structure. And many people saw that they lose status if they're anti-woke, and they gain status if they're woke, of course, always depending on the context. And there's also meaning. If you believe that you are on the right side of history and your protest and your efforts are making the world better, that's deeply meaningful. But again, that is all within an entire worldview of the way you think things are. All right, let's go back to the other video.
In the thinking that you go somewhere after you die and you live the rest of eternity in bliss or agony or something like this. But
okay, and well, as he's about to say,
things like reincarnation and other forms of wanting to sort of escape our own mortality.
Now those are all sort of control access elements, and they are common among religions. So Alex is correct that this isn't just about Christianity. You sort of have different forms. And I would argue that even for atheism, part of your control axis is, well, when I die, it's null. So it's just like I don't remember before I'm born. For most of us, I'm sure some of you out there will tell me about your past lives. I don't remember before I'm born. After I'll die, I won't remember. So what? If you kill me or if I die, so what? So that's sort of a control access mechanism.
This would seem to accord with the idea. I mean, if it were true that this is the relevant factor here for something like meaning, this would accord well with the evidence that you've just cited that, yeah, religion does it better. It doesn't matter which religion.
Now, again, notice that meaning was the first one that James listed, and control access is the third. And many of these elements, for them to really work and spread and go viral among people, the more, and I'd say that there are more axes than just these three, the more axes that a particular proposition can take care of, the better that proposition is probably going to flourish within the various competing subgroups of the religion. And this is, I think, part of the reason why, now I'm going to set something off, part of the reason why universalism in Christianity just always stays a minority position. Sorry, that's what I think.
But it's better than, secular thinking. Maybe that's because the thing that these have in common, even though they might have different kinds of gods and different kinds of ethical codes and the kind of things that we usually think in gender community spirit, the thing that really makes a mockery of the concept of meaning is the fact that it all comes to an end. So I wonder if you think that there's any legitimacy in the view that death makes a mockery of meaning, and that if that's the case, this might be an explainer as to why religion has traditionally been such a successful source of wisdom.
Now, at this point, when I was listening to this, I thought, it's like the third base coach has been stealing signs. It's just going to be a baseball reference. Some of you, it's going to be lost on it because, of course, baseball is sort of an old-timey sport. Or we might use a Super Bowl reference that somehow the New England Patriots have been, intercepting the transmission of the opposing team, because it's like, I'm going to go back to baseball, because it's like Alex is sort of on the mound. The sign has been stolen. He's slowly winding up, and John is there. He caught from the third base coach. He transmitted the sign, and John, this is a question John really engages with and has a lot of thoughts over. And so, okay, big fat meatball coming right down the middle of the plate. Here we go.
Okay, let's take a look at that. The first thing is, I'm not sure that that's a universal. You cited Buddhism, and I've been practicing within Buddhism. I'm not a Buddhist, but I've been practicing it. I mean, one of the practices we do is we try to do the horror of the conceptual.
Don't school me on Buddhism, young fella. No, John does not mean that. John is an incredibly gracious person. So he's not as trolly as I am. So see, therefore Christianity doesn't work because look at me.
Of immortality. That if you actually wanted to be immortal, well, what does that mean? Well, you don't want to die, but you don't want your friends to die and their friends to die, and then as soon as the whole world, and then none of the animals can die, and so you're freezing the universe, and you get this experience of horror, because of course you're not trying to achieve immortality in Buddhism. One way of understanding Buddhism, ad-atman, is you're actually trying to let go of the desire for immortality. So,
and I think actually that point reinforces Alex's point, that this connection between meaning and time is so common to human beings. And because it's common to human beings, again, it doesn't make it true, but because it's common to human beings, it's going to be pervasive. And for that reason, the Buddhists have to work really hard to try and train it out of people, because the Buddhists, now we're going to switch back to the propositional, because the Buddhists have a propositional truth they're trying to maintain, so now they're going to develop a practice to try to train this out of human beings. Now, all religions, one way or another, I would say most religions, one way, I'm not going to say all, because are going to try and train certain natural behaviors out of human beings the way I try to train certain natural behaviors out of this dog that I'm trying to train.
So again, I don't know if that's a universal. Secondly, when you look at meaning in life, it has this weird characteristic. As I said, think about it. This is how you can determine what gives people meaning in life. What do you want to exist even if you didn't? And how much of a difference do you make to it right now? And people will give you very ready, like if there's meaning in their life, they have good answers to that. Now, is it the case that we want immortality and meaning is the sort of the Gilgamesh quest for immortality? I don't know. I mean, Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius in particular, seems to really consider the possibility that he's completely mortal. And that means that one way of understanding Stoicism, not the only way, of course, but is it saying, stop trying to control the narrative length of your life. Try to increase your access to the ontological depth at which you're living it. And this is the idea that once you've...
Again, same point I made before, the connection between meaning and the future and the past is super pause natural for human beings. It is instinctive. We do it now. Is it is part of universal human culture, I would say, by virtue of the commonness of afterlife, anticipation, dreams, rewards, punishment. I mean, that is such a common feature in religions that it should lead us to believe that this is this is sort of like slipping off a log for religions. You're gonna have to have this because you want to employ this narrative sequence in terms of motivated meaning practices within your religion.
You've achieved, sagehood. It doesn't matter how much. If you died the next moment, that was a life, that was a fulfilled life. So I mean, I'm just
saying, and so therefore, in trying to resist it, so then you're obviously going to have to sort of. It's sort of like I'll pull up the picture again. It's like this billboard that it hasn't appeared for a number of Easters. I kind of miss them. I mean, because maybe they just really can't get the bucks together because the price of marijuana dispensaries has run the costs off of local billboards, because those are the only kind of billboards I seem to see in the neighborhood. God, free, happy, and inspired by wonder. I can make wonder all by myself. Oh, okay, but that's not the natural way. You can make diamonds without, lots and lots of time, but kind of the way that most people got them was they pulled them out of the ground.
Saying, I think there are clear examples where the answer given, Epicurus is another example, right? He tries to liberate people from the fear of death, the fear of the gods. And I think Epicureanism is one of these religious philosophy kinds of things.
And in many ways, Epicureanism is, I think, something that's quite close to American contemporary atheism. It tends to be sort of Epicurean.
Insofar as it's doing a lot of the functions, you have the communities, you have practices, you even have confession, a lot of stuff like that. So I that's how I would first push back on that, the one part of the thesis. Like I said, people seem to think meaning doesn't seem to be working in terms of sensation, because you can also get people to, like I say, you can do the horror of immortality, where they will find an endless existence also completely meaningless. And so I wonder.
I do think, if I may.
Now, Alex is about to So maybe the first pitch was kind of it was supposed to be a fast ball, but it didn't quite have everything on it. So this long, slow meatball right down the middle of the plate. But Alex has a second pitch in him, and this one's got a lot more mustard on it. Because, again, you still have the problem of we're trying to talk people out of it. And part of the reason we're going to talk people out of this sort of very natural way of making meaning is by saying, okay, well, now let's imagine everlastingness and think about that in terms of maybe waiting at the DMV. You don't want that, do you? And, so The Good Place, that's where The Good Place sort of ended up. And it said, well, and others have made this argument, well, terminations make things meaningful in terms of, I just thought of another video that I can bring into this. Terminations make things meaningful. And they have a good point. But now Alex has some mustard on this pitch.
Hey, there's sometimes a bit of a sleight of hand in the conversation about the desirability of immortality. Somebody says, well, I don't like the fact that I'm mortal. I don't like the fact that my days are numbered and that afterwards I'm just going to rot in the ground. And somebody says, well, to console you, consider the opposite. Consider being immortal. Consider watching all of your friends and family die. Consider having to experience something like the end of the universe and the heat death. Well, okay, sure, that's not great either. But I think the kind of immortality that religious thinking often strives after is not a materialistic immortality. It's not that I get to live on planet Earth in this same house and doing the same things and interacting with the same people, but rather that there is still this thing called death, but that there's more that comes after it in a different kind of way. And I think that there is still a point to be made about a kind of Sisyphean meaninglessness of just living out your days in eternal bliss or something like this. But if we imagine something like an Abrahamic, I should say, a sort of Christian or Islamic sense of afterlife, that is the kind of thing that escapes this objection that, well, living forever would be horrible in at least the most obvious respect as to why it would be horrible. What would be so bad about that kind of eternity, that kind of immortality? And is it, even if it is bad and does have some sort of things that make us shudder, should it really make us shudder as much as thinking that the lights just switch off and there's nothing afterwards?
Wow. That had some mustard on. Now, before we get into John's response, it's important to remember that John, in fact, he says it in this video, it could be on my Not Utopia, Not Nostalgia. So he's working on the Not Utopia right now. But he also has Not Nostalgia. Now, I was actually thinking about this morning and thinking about the fact that what we're really dealing with is dealing with, let's say, the hyperobject of meaning. And it is not located in time.
Kind of unity that we attribute to our prototypical object. So here's my jackknife. This is a prototypical object. Notice it has parts and the parts interact. But notice what I can do with it. It is local. It has a determinate Cartesian coordinate specificity in time and place. And here it is. Here it is. And if it's here, it can't be here. Right? Now, it can take up a continuous space, but it is localized. Now, the first important property about hyperobjects like global warming and evolution is they're non-local. You can't point and say, there, in Wisconsin, right, there's evolution. It's like, well, no. What do you mean? Evolution doesn't work. It's not, you can't point to a particular time and space. Now, that doesn't mean it's an eternal object like 2 + 2 = 4, because it's taking place in time and space. So this is very tricky for us. We have these two sort of categories we've developed in the West. The concrete, there it is, time and space. The abstract, not in time and space, 2 + 2 = 4. And then we have the strange intercategorical non-locality of things like evolution.
And I would say that that's where meaning is. It's not sort of just an eternal category, and it's not local. And time runs in a funny way with it. Now, one of my favorite Jordan Peterson conversations over the last little while that was not, didn't sort of ring alarm bells off to everyone was his conversation with Clay Rutledge with respect to nostalgia. Because I sort of, like John, had I think kind of a classist knee-jerk reaction to nostalgia, partly bred by the fact that when I was a young person going into a Christian bookstore, I wanted to see meaty theological books, and all I could get was kitsch. And I have grown to believe that for as much as I don't necessarily appreciate kitsch, it has its place, and it's powerful. And I think the same is true of nostalgia.
To the ideas we've been talking about, people turn, just like people are aware of our ability, our temporal consciousness, right? Our ability to move the self through time allows us to go into the future and think about our mortality, as we've been talking about. So that we think that
we go into the future. And I think this is exactly what Alex is talking about. We go into the future, we go into the past.
That's somewhat unique to humans, right? That we can think long into the future and think about a future without us. And so what I thought was, interestingly, that might provoke us to turn to the past. Because if I'm thinking about a future and it makes me anxious or uncertain, I can look to the past at meaningful memories, and I can kind of comfort myself to be like, no, I have had a good life. I have people that care about me. I've done interesting things, and that can make me feel, that can kind of reinstate or boost my meaning if I'm feeling potentially meaningless because of the inevitability of my mortality. So that's
okay. So control axis, we saw that. Nostalgia is mining the past for meaning, for comfort, because of course meaning is a powerful thing for human beings that keep us alive. We can endure almost anyhow if we have a why. And so in the doldrums of our moment, we mine the past for meaning. And religion, of course, allows us to sort of reach into the future. And what nihilism and atheist nihilism has basically done is cut off these mechanisms for comfort. And what's interesting is that, again, it's as in terms of a religion and the popularity of this religion, it sort of slits its own throat because it tries to bolster it, sort of like John was talking about with respect to the Stoics. I don't need this kind of bolstering of trying to derive fictitious, false meaning from a hypothetical, theoretical, fictitious fantasy future. I can live without it. Sarah Hyder says, I don't know if I can make myself believe something that I don't believe. Yeah, well, okay. But in that sense, you're just sort of using pride of self as a replacement for this other mechanism. And again, with nihilism, who's to say that one mechanism is better than the other? You're just filling yourself with pride because you're, in a sense, using nostalgia for some imagined Stoic past of godless people, of which you can't find a lot. Godless people who sometimes, it's almost a romanticism because it's much more of a sensibility and a feeling than anything referential in terms of a materialist correspondent type truth worldview. So, yeah. Now, this pitch had a lot more on it. So this, I think, yeah, well, let's hear what John has to say, and then I've got a few more things to say.
It's okay. So, the first thing you say is my response to that is I think there's a reverse sleight of hand. I think there's the pretense that we're talking about something radically different than what we have here and now. But if you actually look into the mythos where it's not vague, it's actually just a copy of here now. It just extended. And when it's not, it's irredeemably vague.
Now, I know a lot of Christians are going to jump in and say, no, but that's actually a pretty strong point. And I've made this point often, and I've shared sometimes some of my own questions about the life of the age to come, because the Bible doesn't give us a lot of information. And in fact, usually it's no eye have seen, no ear has heard, it's ineffable, which again isn't unreasonable, because the truth is that our ability to navigate the world. Again, I was just finished listening to The Rest is History, this 8-part series on the fall of the Aztecs. One of the things that, when we talk about UFOs and space travel, one of the analogies that we can draw are the Spaniards first coming into what would become Mexico City, because it was another world. They and all of it was the beauty, and it was just amazing, and that beauty they would destroy. So human beings are remarkably easy to disorient. As a pastor, I also know that, let's say there's a car accident and someone has lost a spouse, and so as a pastor or as a chaplain, you might be called upon to go and deliver this news. And the minute that, someone comes to the door and sees the pastor and a police officer standing there together with faces that suggest this isn't going to be good news, whoosh, disorientation. So John's point is fair, that what do we know about the life of the age to come? Now, again, C.S. Lewis tries to go there with The Last Battle and try to talk about, in really a Platonic sense, what that might look like. So that's a fair point.
And I don't know how such vagueness could possibly console people. That's one thing.
But it's not. The consolation is, in fact, a projection. You cannot knock down the reality of the consolation. Now, you might say that it is unfounded in some sense, but it is still there for the purposes of meaning making. And again, whatever the underpinning says nothing about its ontology. That's a whole nother conversation. But the fact that people don't know, it's sort of like, again, I love this illustration by C.S. Lewis. He's talking to a child and somehow sex comes up. And a child asks, will there be chocolate? And of course, now any adult who has had a sex life kind of snickers sometimes. But once you get there, you won't worry about chocolate. And actually, there's a lot of that in these descriptions as well. You might have streets of gold and a city foursquare and all of that, but yeah, you're not probably going to be worried about the chocolate anymore when you get to that other realm.
And then the other one is, what what is the nature of the objection? It's a purely affective response. I don't like to think of the world with me not existing in it. Well, again, there's that Epicurean argument. Well, you're not really upset about the world that existed before you were here. So it's not that abstract metaphysical.
Well, we're not. I mean, there's been a whole lot of people wringing their hands about colonialism and all sorts of other things, about before and slavery and all sorts of big bad things. Now, we do care about the world that was before us, because that world that was before us has very much impacted the world that was here. But again, don't expect regular people to really have thought this thing through. And that point sort of counts both ways. But again, a child who fortunately has never trodden into the adult world of sex just doesn't know a lot about it. And they might still someday say, I want to grow up and get married and have babies. That's not an illegitimate thing. They don't know anything about it. But there it is.
fact. It's something like you losing, like you being in that moment of the lights going out. And that's a different thing. And then what I can say to you is, well, we're getting increasing evidence that, we can ameliorate that affect while people are still around in powerful ways. Some of the psychedelic research is already showing that. And maybe the religions were
Let me finish the one fish.
good at doing that. And I'm willing to consider that given, the thesis we're discussing here. But my response then is, that doesn't require that, meaning has to be everlasting, and nor does it require some supernatural framework just to say, well, what we're actually talking about is we want to be able to alleviate people's affective anxiety as they face dying. And maybe the religions did things around that. Can we capture that functionality? Yes. And that would be my response to the second part.
Okay, but that's tricky, because do we really want to ameliorate that when in fact, now he's going to make an objection with respect to morality here, but many people hesitated to, let's say, rob, steal, rape, take another person's life because they were concerned with afterlife consequences. And this is a point that I've made often with respect to Miroslav Volf makes a similar point in Exclusion and Embrace, where in atheist societies, once you foreshorten sort of the assumed purview of someone's existence, now all justice must be meted out in this world. And Jesus, in a sense, can't go to the cross and say, I will lay down my life for the sheep, when it's just losing his life. There's no resurrection. There's nothing to be gained, maybe in a poetic thing, but go back to Alex O'Connor's point that there's just nothing to be gained. So maybe, Jesus, you should live your best life now, even at the cost of other people's misery, because this is the only system. And many of these systems that, in fact, on a moral basis, have stretched things out into afterlives, have, in fact, made this life better. I'll use myself for an example. Let's say, for example, I spend enough time and I am now convinced that, well, I no longer face a final judgment. There no longer is an afterlife reward, that I have spent the first 60 years of my life. I've spent a lot of time with some people that aren't necessarily a lot of fun. They were annoying. They talked too much. They were crazy. They had substance abuse issues. And I did this all. What a dupe. I thought I was making Jesus happy. I should have been an Epicurean. I should have gone out and had my best life now. And all this idea about being generous to the poor, being kind to strangers, do all of this. Well, you should do that. Well, why should I? It's a lot more fun playing Civilization than spending my time sitting next to someone who reeks of alcohol, listening to them talk for the 50th time about how the person running their care home is not treating them right. Don't I have better things to do? Yes, but why do I sit there? Partly because Jesus wants me to. And all those doctors going to Africa, why are they going to Africa when they could make bank in the developed world? Because Jesus wants them to. And because they'll, don't store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy. Store up treasures in heaven. Now, Jordan Peterson might say aim high, but I'm aiming even higher. So that's my answer.
I think on the first point about vagueness, I see what you're saying, that these descriptions of afterlife seem to either just be a carbon copy of our current human experience, or they're sort of irredeemably vague. I think the religious response to that, at least, would be to say what's often said about describing the attributes of God, where people describe God as powerful, as loving, as strong, and this kind of thing. But famously...
this boy's got game! Wow!
One of the most important contributions of Thomas Aquinas was to point out that all religious language is metaphorical. God is not powerful. God is not strong. because
Yes.
these are sort of human terms to describe human things. But if we tried to describe it in divine terms, we would get lost. We wouldn't have the terminology, and it would be hopelessly vague. And so we sort of have to compromise by describing things in terms that aren't quite accurate, but yet we can understand. And so when you hear people talk about the afterlife and it sounds like a carbon copy of human lived experience, I think even if there's not always an awareness in the people who hear this, I think the intention must be something more like providing an analogy. Like, of course, this isn't what actually happens. It's more like the sort of hopelessly vague language. It's more like what that seems to describe. But in order to give us any idea of what we have to come, we have to compromise here, right?
This is great. I like this. So my response to that is, I don't think that your desire to keep living is metaphorical and symbolic like that. I think it is concrete and very specific. And I don't think you want to metaphorically, symbolically have immortality. I think you concretely, specifically do not want to die as the particular person you are. And so again, by the way,
I'm not sure that's true. It's true that their analogy of living, but their analogy of living is almost always an upgrade. I had a good friend who, although anybody looking at his life in this world would not have necessarily said he had a great life. He didn't particularly have a lot of money. He enjoyed life. He loved a good meal. He loved spending. If he were alive for the estuary thing, oh my goodness, he would be every time I'd open the door for an estuary, he would be there waiting to have a conversation with all of his new friends. Just loved music, loved food, loved people. But all of his love of food, he had been an alcoholic and got sober, went through 12-step program, was a big AA for a number of years, but he always overate. And I've told these stories before. When he died, his wife found a whole box of screwdrivers. He somehow collected screwdrivers, and he wasn't a guy to fix anything. And he had a house just filled with records, tapes, and CDs. So the fact that she had to find someone to come and just get them out of the house because there were rooms full of them. But when it came, and I would talk to him, and I would say, what God has in store for you is so much better even than the opera that you've had. He didn't believe me. He just didn't believe me. So this is people, it's not just more life, it's definitely better life. And that also is universal. And again, that doesn't mean it's true, but it sure means it's common. And if you're going to try and buck it, you're going to have a hard time.
I think there's value in what Aquinas says when you're trying to talk about things like the ground of being or the grounds of intelligibility, and you're pumping up against the limits of thought. But I don't think we're talking about the limits of thought here. I think our death, is a phenomenological mystery to us. I can't imagine what it's like to be dead. But that doesn't license any kind of conclusion. So I don't think it's like the kind of
people drive without a license all the time.
Boundaries of conceptuality and intelligibility that I think can license why we need to refer to symbolic or metaphorical language. But I don't think it's kind of issue.
To be clear, I do think, I agree with you that yes, the kind of immortality that a person might seek is going to be concrete. You don't want metaphorical eternality, because you could achieve that by like writing a poem in some respects, or at least you could extend your life metaphorically by writing a poem. But what I'm saying is that the desire is concrete for something beyond death, but the thing that we want that's beyond death, I don't think is going to be like this kind of life, because of the problems we've already mentioned, that if it were, I'd have to watch everyone I know and love die in front of me or something like this. And not to mention the sort of metaphysical problem of living in the heat death of the universe. I don't even know what it would mean for me to continue existing in that kind of space, right? And so clearly, if we're talking about immortality, we're talking about something different. The desire is concrete. You want something real. You want something that's actually going to happen. The metaphorical contribution is in our description of the concrete thing that we want to achieve. Because I couldn't hope to understand what the thing is that would allow a person to escape mortality in this way. And so the kind of language that I'm going to use to describe it has to essentially be poetic. I have to talk about, maybe a land flowing of milk and honey, or I talk about, eternal bliss, or I sort of imagine myself as nowhere and everywhere at the same time, and I sort of use words like this, recognizing that these are essentially metaphors. These aren't literal descriptions of what it's going to be like, but although
physical,
my language is metaphorical, the thing that it's providing a metaphor for is a very real, concrete thing that I desire.
Yeah, but so you're desiring the concrete thing that you can't give me any specific concrete content to.
Yes, in exactly the same way.
And why is that not just as much of an unintelligible thing as non-existence? Like what is the gain?
I don't know if it's sort of more intelligible per se, because we run into the same problems of trying to understand what it might be like to not exist. Again, we're immediately not able to describe this accurately, because the moment you're thinking about you not existing, you're existing, right? And so there are problems of intelligibility in both. But I think the desirability, there's at least plausibly a great asymmetry in the potential desirability. I mean, both of these are kind of these mystical realms that we can't really understand. And when I shouldn't say mystical, I should say something like mystifying, because I don't want to give the impression that I'm talking about something non-real here. What I'm saying is that the language we use to capture these is always going to be insufficient. But we can get an idea of the kind of thing we're talking about. And I think that an eternal life of bliss in an afterlife, again, metaphorical language to describe a concrete thing, is better than the concrete thing of non-existence described in the metaphorical language of, the lights turning out or something like that. In exactly the same way that if somebody talks about God and they desire God and they believe in God, as Aquinas would have it, they are always talking in terms of analogy. They're never using words that are actually accurate, but that doesn't mean that God himself is an analogy or a metaphor. The language we use to describe his attributes are, but he's real.
I get that, and what I said, I think there's a difference. I think there are like independent arguments that motivate the fact that the source of intelligibility can itself be intelligible and things like that. I don't see the parallel arguments for immortality. And then I would give back to you, is given that you've agreed that this is metaphorical and vague and non-specific, the desire and affect, of course, it can, especially like this, it can be discharged in multiple ways. What about the Stoic or even the Platonic proposal? Well, you're actually not, what you're desiring isn't immortality, you're desiring eternity. You're desiring to come into contact with that which is not bound by time and space, and therefore more real. And we already have lots of independent evidence that you want to be in contact with what's real, what's more real, and that would make sense and fit together. And again,
and those two, again, people drive without a license all the time. They certainly mingle and blur. And so as a Christian minister, I see that all the time in terms of the kitsch in a store about, oh, we're going to go to heaven and be with Jesus. And of course, theologically correct, say, heaven, you're going to be with Christ and in intermediate state, and blah, 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 blah. The theologians are always sort of fussing down here with the language, but for people, it's all one aspirational goodness, and it's connected with what they have going on down here.
I can't see what argument these people would offer, given what you've just said. It's so irredeemably vague. I can just say, I think what you're really talking about, and the fact that people use these terms synonymously and they're not, like eternity and immortality, I could say, well, I think you're actually talking, and I'm saying I'm not the only person who's proposed this, you're actually talking about eternity, and here's why you want eternity. And this makes sense. And, you have the Platonic and Stoic and even the Buddhist answers. Buddhism is about sort of realizing eternity without wanting immortality.
Maybe you can help elucidate this for me, the difference between immortality and eternity. It seems to me that at least immortality entails eternity. I don't think it's true in the reverse, but what are we talking about? What's the meaningful distinction here?
So this is like the distinction that the Greeks made about their gods. Their gods are immortal in that they will keep going on and on, but their existence is bound by time and space. Mathematical truths, just to use a Platonic example, are eternal. They're not bound by the contingencies of time and space. And so coming into relationship with what is eternal. I understand why that matters, because I think access to that I don't like the term abstract because it sounds like it's just a mental thing. I'm not talking just epistemologically, but access to that abstract domain is powerfully important for many of our self-corrective individual and collective projects. I can understand why that is something that human beings hunger for. And this is Spinoza's position too. We're looking for a kind of eternity, although we can't find it immortality. So that's the distinction I'm invoking.
Okay, so talk to me about how death of the kind where, as we've the language we've used so far, lights out, nothing more. Talk to me about how that doesn't just laugh in the face of a conception of meaning. And I think the reason why people will intuitively understand what I mean there, but just to make it absolutely clear, you might want to say something like, well, you can have temporal meaning. It doesn't need to, just because a story ends, it doesn't mean that the story isn't meaningful. Of course, when a story ends, there's still a world outside of the story in which the meaning can be ascertained and in which you can sort of interact with that meaning and experience that meaning. If the story ends, and so does the person who read it, and so does everybody else who's ever going to read it, then I think, was it Pascal who talked about how everything is obliterated in the presence of the infinite. It doesn't matter if your life is 1 year or 5 years. It doesn't matter if it's got a little bit of meaning or a lot of meaning. If you have this infinite eternity of non-existence awaiting you, everything just collapses in the face of it and becomes, if not negligibly small, then impossibly small. It sort of reduces to a singularity of nothingness.
So let me make sure I'm understanding you correctly. The idea is that when we're talking about this connectedness, we're talking about a connection to a world that itself never ends, or something like that. Because you said it doesn't matter if I personally die, as long as the meaning I've made gets picked up by other people or the world or something like that. Is that the case?
I personally think that it does, but I understand that some people might like to say, well, I know that I'm going to die, but I can do things that are going to outlive me, and that's where I find my meaning. But of course, that all will come to an end as well, and I think that's the problem. I mean, you won't need me to explain to you why it is that people will consider the fact that they're going to die, and that seemingly the universe is going to end, and everyone they know is going to die, everyone that could exist is going to die, and that somehow undermines a sense of meaning. You'll understand that that's a common thing that people think. I'm just wondering if you can reflect on that for us.
I do, and what I would say is, I think
Alex is kind of like a dog in a bone here. He's not letting up. He said, "Oh no, we're." And he's got a good point here, so he's hitting it hard.
Trying to bind meaning in that way ultimately makes the connection purely instrumental in nature. And I would say to you, what makes a moral act meaningful is that human beings are intrinsically valuable, and there are states that are intrinsically valuable. Realizing enlightenment for the Buddhist is intrinsic.
Okay, human beings are intrinsically valuable, but they're not ultimately valuable. And that's another important difference here. And that's something that people struggle with, because as human life gains value in terms of the economy of the world, and we're going to get rid of slavery, we're going to worry about people suffering, we're going to do all of this. People, again, the absolute and the everlasting get combined for people, and well, human beings are ultimately valuable. It's not really the biblical position. Human beings aren't ultimately absolutely valuable. They're intrinsically valuable because, again, of their relationship with that which is ultimately valuable.
Intrinsically valuable doesn't need to persist for that intrinsic value to go on. In fact, the problem with making it instrumental is it's doomed to fail, because I keep deferring what is ultimately the final thing that retroactively confers all the meaning on everything. And then I ask you, well, why let's say it went the other way, right?
Now, again, that's a strong point. Alex is pitching hard, but John's not easy to get him to strike out.
Right? And whether or not there's going to be heat death is now controversial, of course. and it's like, well, why does that convey meaning all the way back? I won't ever experience that. That will have no impact on me. And so I want to say that, people want to be bound to things that they consider to have an intrinsic value, not an instrumental value. And if you ask me, well, why should we consider things to have intrinsic value? That's for me, that's just constitutive of being an agent. If you're not capable of finding agency intrinsically valuable, then you're not a self-making, look, we only care about this information rather than that information because we're perpetually taking care of ourselves. That's constitutive of us. We have to find our own agency intrinsically valuable. And of course, I think we should find other agency intrinsically valuable. And so I think I would worry about trying to slip this into a endlessly deferred instrumental framing. I would want to say, no. If I can get connected to the things that have an intrinsic value, and there's something sort of eternal about that, because their value isn't contingently, temporally, spatially bound, right? Then that's what gives me that kind of meaning that I'm talking about.
Strong point. Again, this is just awesome. But. I'm going to play another video.
We were talking before we got started. I had this conversation with Robert Sapolsky, and it was really, really profound. I mean, I know that he's a brilliant guy, and this new book of his is about sort of free will and determinism, which has got an upper bound on how interesting that is for me. But he gave this quote to Andrew Huberman where he said, dopamine is not about the pursuit of happiness. It is about the happiness of pursuit.
Right. That's definitely right.
And I haven't been able to stop seeing this everywhere. So Morgan Housel, a friend, told me this great story. He is an investor. He's got a fund. He's an author. He's got a family. He's got all of these things. Yeah. They plan to go away on holiday. And they've been planning it for a long time. And with the kids and the wife and him and all of his businesses, it was an arduous thing to go through to get themselves out there. And finally, they get there after the journey and the plane and the children and the crying and all of the rest of it. And he walks out on the balcony on the first night of this holiday that they've planned for forever. And his first thought to himself was, wouldn't it be great if we came back here next year? It would be so great if we could come back here next year. So
kind of John's point, but it's not the only point.
Literally during the supposed enjoyment of the destination, he was already thinking about the journey. And, it's not the journey, it's not the destination, it's the journey is kind of trite, but it puts a new perspective on it. There is no destination. Each destination is simply the beginning of the next journey. And I haven't not been...
And that's sort of a way of framing, that's a way of saying John's argument in sort of a more common way that folks can understand without the philosophical language.
Being able to see it. I see it everywhere. I see it everywhere in my own life.
Well, there's technically two different forms of reward. There's consumatory reward. And so that's the reward. That's what an orgasm is. It's consumatory reward. It brings the behavioral and perceptual sequence to a halt. It ends it, right? At the climax, it ends it. But then it's over. That journey is over, right? Then there's the dopaminergic reward that Sapolsky was talking about. And dopaminergic reward is evidence of advancement towards a goal. Right. Okay, so there's a corollary to that. Well, how do you become optimally engaged? Because dopamine facilitates engagement and focus, which is why drugs like amphetamines can be used for kids who are attention deficit disordered. You tap up the dopamine response, they lock on, right? Okay, so they're locking on to a goal-directed pursuit. The problem with amphetamines is that they can lock you on so hard you can't get out of the frame. So like kids on amphetamines will obsess, for example, about cleaning up their closet. They can't switch to the next activity. Okay, dopaminergic reward is reward that's accrued in relationship to a goal. Okay, so what's an implication of that? Well, pursue the highest possible goal. Well, why? Because the kick from advancement is higher. Now, you have to balance that. It can't be, you have to advance, right? Because imagine the reward's got two components. Number one is you're moving towards something valuable. Okay, so you want it to be as valuable as possible. Okay, but you have to be moving. So it can't be so valuable that...
And when you listen to this, and when I hear him talking this way, I think, well, this is how religion works. This is exactly, it's got the highest possible thing. Now it's vague because we're always vague about highest possible things. And we don't know a lot about it. You think, well, I could be CEO of that company. Do you have any idea what it'd be like to be CEO of that company? No. But it's the highest possible thing, or higher than that. Well, but then there's, and what's interesting, it's consumatory. Where have I heard that word before? What do Christians call the climax of history? They don't call it the orgasm. They call it the consummation. That's how it functions in the system. Now, the fact that people are vague with respect to the consummation should surprise none of us, but that doesn't mean that the way it functions is illegitimate or difficult to understand. Now, again, you can be skeptical about its reality, but the fact that it functions and functions so well, which was, if you go all the way back to where Alex started this conversation, that was his point, that these religions are still around. This is sort of the Darwinian argument about religion. These religions are still around because they function so darn well. Now you might say, well, they're untrue and they're BS or whatever, but they work because they work, and it's built into us.
That it's out of your reach.
If you're going to walk to the moon, I'm not going to be able to see every single increment that I make.
Yes. You want to get to the moon, that's right. You can't walk there, so it's a bad plan. You need something extremely valuable that you can move towards. Okay, so part of the reason that you establish a relationship with God, let's say, is because that's what sets the upper bound to your vision. It's like, I want things to be the best they could be. That's a vision of paradise. Well, that has to be fractionated into, your proximal decisions, but lurking behind that should be this continual movement towards, what would you say, a heaven that recedes as you approach it. That's the proper vision of heaven. A heaven is a place that's perfect and getting better, both at the same time. That's what music shows you, because a great piece of music is perfect, but it's just getting better as it unfolds. And you need that.
And music is consumatory because again, it's like the kid with chocolate. Will there be chocolate? It's like, well, we're going to go to this. We're going to listen to the best music you've ever heard. Will there be chocolate? Well, I suppose you can bring some with you. That's okay. But I think in the moment, it's not going to be about the chocolate.
This is part of the problem with a static utopian vision, something Dostoevsky criticized. If you gave people nothing but consumatory reward, he famously says, so that they can do nothing but sit in tubs of hot water, eat cake, and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, human beings would break that all to hell in a moment just so they have something interesting to do.
What was that quote that you said on Rogan years ago? If we were to make the world sufficiently perfect, the only desired lack would be for the desire of lack itself. What's that?
That's
What is
Kierkegaard.
that? What's the proper? Can you remember the proper?
Well, Kierkegaard pointed out that if as we make the world easier and easier, so this is perhaps part of the problem with the material plenty that's at hand, is that at some point what becomes lacking is lack itself.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Exactly. It's optimal deprivation. And if everything is delivered to you on a platter, it's like, what the hell are you even doing there? This happens in the story of Abraham. So Abraham, who's the father of nations, right? So Abraham gets it right. He has everything at the beginning of the story. He has rich parents. He's got nothing that he has to do. He's like 70 when the story opens. He's been taken care of hand and foot his whole life. And the voice of God comes to him and says, I'm the God of your ancestors, telling you, get out of your zone of comfort. Get out into the world. And Abraham's pretty old by this point. But for whatever reason, he decides that he's going to forgo the comfort for the adventure. And then as Abraham progresses, he makes the requisite sacrifices, each becoming more difficult as he ascends. And he adopts this pattern of relationship with the God that calls him to adventure, that literally makes him the father of nations. And so you can even think about that biologically if you want. You might as well. People like Dawkins think reproduction is sex. And that's why he can talk, for example, about the selfish gene making itself manifest in sex. Reproduction isn't sex. Sex is a necessary but insufficient precondition for reproduction. Abraham adopts a mode of being, a sacrificial mode of being, that establishes the optimal environment for his sons, who then establish the optimal environment for their sons, and their sons, and their sons. So you can imagine that what Abraham is doing, this is what the story means, is he's adopting a mode of behavior that works best, all things considered, across multiple generations. And he sacrifices everything to that. It's this incredibly expansive vision.
Given that we're in a world which is comfortable, and we have created buildings in which there are heavy things that you pick up and put down in the same place because it's simply so rare that you have to pick up heavy things, right?
Right.
The
We have
proliferation.
speed bumps.
Okay, and this is where we picked up before. But you can see all of this is sort of built in. And before Abraham leaves Ur, he doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't know what's going to happen. And, again, I'll put my cards on the table. This is one of the things that I think about with respect to descriptions of the age to come. And I think about the dopaminergic pursuit and say, will that be taken from us in the age to come? Well, how do I comfort myself with respect to this control axis? I say, hey, I don't even have any idea what that's going to look like. I think Lewis is right that it will be. The only way it's going to be meaningful and comprehensible for us is if in some ways it connects up with our experience here and now. At the same time, if God could make a world like this, which is already beyond us and has glory beyond what we can see, it's also got pain, I can trust him to make the next one and to be good and true to his promises. So this was a great conversation, and yeah, it was really good. It was really good. I hope you've enjoyed walking through it with me, and can't wait to hear what you have to say in the comment section.